Crosswalks Television.
One of the striking things about the city is how its history, including key moments of its history, like consolidation, happen almost without our knowing it, because the city is so vital, it's so creative, that we tend to forget that it has history. It's a truth about New York City that it's never had one ideology, one principle, one ruling way of thinking. That's been the genius of it. Every now and then it's needed to have people come in and buy into a unified vision of the future.
In 1896, a college student, Catalina Paez, wrote a letter to the chairman of the New York State Joint Committee on Cities.
On the 10th of April, there will take place the annual prize debate between the Alpha Beta Gamma and the Philomathian Literary Societies of the Normal College of New York City. The subject chosen for discussion is it expedient that the Greater New York Bill become a law?
The issue that concerned Catalina was called consolidation. It would also be debated in editorial pages, saloons, and the New York State Legislature before it was settled. It twisted friends into rivals and turned two very different men, one a Democrat, the other a Republican, into triumphant political allies. It united 40 separate municipalities to create the city of New York that we know today, and legislated the third largest city in the United States out of existence. This is the story of the creation of the city of Greater New York. Three major islands at the mouth of the Hudson River create one of the world's greatest harbors. In 1896, New York City, consisting of the island of Manhattan and the present-day Bronx, was the largest city in the country. It had a population of 2 million and was the unrivaled hub of American business. The skyline that would come to define it was already apparent. The surrounding communities were less developed. Staten Island, known as Richmond County, had a few port facilities, farms, and even iron mines. Queens County had a dual personality. Eastern Queens was farmland, Western Queens was factories. There was only one municipality that could compare to New York in terms of size, development, and sophistication, and that was the city of Brooklyn. Only New York and Chicago were more populous. Many had long thought that the two cities would unite, but Brooklyn and New York were uneasy neighbors across the East River, and the roots of their enmity were as old as the cities themselves. In 1748, the ferry house on the Brooklyn side of the East River burned to the ground. New Yorkers, whose city owned the ferry and the ferry house, accused spiteful Brooklynites of having torched the building. New York City's charter gave it total jurisdiction of the East River, right up to the Brooklyn waterline.
Brooklyn had to provide a wharf and had to provide streets and connections to the ferries so that people could get to the ferries, but Brooklyn could not collect the revenues generated by the ferries.
Brooklyn had begun as one of 6 towns in Kings County. In 1834, Brooklyn officials asked the state to grant them a city charter. New Yorkers objected. "It is for the interest of the people of this state," they wrote, "to defeat all attempts to establish a distinct and rival commercial community." Brooklyn got its charter, but not before one of its future mayors wrote,
"Between New York and Brooklyn, there is nothing in common, either in object, interest, or feeling, unless it be the waters that flow between them, and even those waters, however frequently passed, must forever continue to form an insurmountable obstacle to their union." General Jeremiah Johnson.
For the next 6 decades, Politicians, businessmen, and journalists tried to unite the cities. There were many proposals, but none more ambitious than State Senator Cyrus P. Smith's. At the time, there was no bridge between the cities, and he suggested filling in the East River with gravel. The cost of the project, he argued, could be covered by the newly created real estate. Commuter rail lines spurred development in Westchester County, so when New York City looked to expand, it looked northward. In 1874, after a referendum, the area south of Yonkers and west of the Bronx River was made part of New York City. 20 years later, the eastern portion would be annexed too. The new area would one day be known as the Bronx. At the time, it was called the Annexed District, or the North Side, and commanded so little respect from the city fathers that it was put under the control of the city's Parks Department. In 1883, when the Great East River Bridge was completed, one paper declared, "What the bridge has joined, let not the politicians keep asunder." The New York Board of Aldermen appointed a committee to consider consolidation, but Brooklyn Mayor Daniel Whitney simply ignored them.
There is thus in the world over no other area of 150 square miles whose welfare could be better promoted by one general administration. Andrew H. Green.
He was a person of inordinate, extraordinary political acumen, the person who knew how to, as Robert Moses would in the next century, knew how to get the job done, knew how to, one way or the other, get the political and financial and ideological forces to line up so that you could do mammoth public works.
His full name was Andrew Haswell Green. He was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1820. Andrew grew up with a very strict father and a rather large family, many children. The family could not afford sending him to college, so he was sent with a sister to New York to seek his fortunes.
He decided to become a lawyer, went into a law office run by Samuel Tilden, grew up to become Tilden's partner and friend in one of the most important law offices in 19th century America.
Green's work with Tilden drew him into Democratic political circles. He was appointed to a state commission to oversee the construction of Central Park, a huge public work designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux.
He really was as responsible, more responsible than Olmsted and Vaux for Central Park, insofar as it was he who really made sure that it was built, that it happened, that it succeeded.
Green developed a reputation as a public servant above political interests. He was a tireless worker with a keen appreciation of design, nature, literature, and history. Olmsted's wife, Mary, wrote that he talked park nearly all the time, but finished with Milton. In 1871, when the press revealed that Tammany boss William Tweed had looted the city's treasury, Tilden arranged to have Green appointed as chief financial officer of the city. Green restored the city's solvency and helped Tilden put the Tweed ring behind bars. It was the beginning of an extraordinary list of accomplishments. Over the following decades, Green had a hand in the creation of many public works, including the Museum of Natural History, the New York Botanical Gardens, the Bronx Zoo, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Riverside Park. Green left another great legacy to New York.
Green and others negotiated a consolidation of the Lenox and Astor trusts with the Tilden bequest to create what became the New York Public Library.
It was kind of a dry run, a rehearsal for the consolidation a few years later. I mean, anybody who could get the Lenox and Astor libraries together surely would have no problem getting the five boroughs together.
In the late 1880s, a powerful new force entered the consolidation picture.
The biggest merchants were headquartered in New York, and their business organization was the Chamber of Commerce of the state of New York. Moving goods by water was just the economical way to go. And New York had the best water location. There was a water connection from New York to Chicago and to Cleveland and to Lake Superior, so that enormous territory was essentially drained through New York by water. The harbor had to work in order for merchants to make money. Some of the docks were new and spiffy and in good repair, and some of them were abandoned and falling apart. Timbers would come out of those docks and float into the water. So you've got lighters, you've got sailing ships, you've got timbers, some of them waterlogged and 3 feet below the surface, like torpedoes, floating around, sinking ships that are trying to do business. The Chamber of Commerce in the 1880s says business is getting so intense in the New York area, the population is so large, we have to have one authority that can control all of New York Harbor. New Yorkers were aware that Chicago was growing rapidly and concerned about how they would meet that competition, and they knew Chicago had grown partly by annexing surrounding territory. Greene simply stepped in, probably as a result of conversation with business leaders, and issued a new statement saying we really ought to have a state commission to investigate the question of whether Greater New York would be a good idea, and if so, how to go about doing it.
The genius of the Andrew Haswell Greenes and the others behind consolidation was they understood how important it was that there be one political entity into which you could now plan subways, other forms of transportation, plan for growth out into what we call the outer boroughs.
Greene got his Greater New York Commission in 1890. He pressed for a bill that would authorize a referendum. His 1892 referendum bill died. He tried again. His 1893 referendum bill died. He tried again. His 1894 referendum bill passed. Not all Brooklynites feared consolidation. Prominent business leaders formed the Consolidation League to press their cause.
2 million pieces of literature were distributed in Brooklyn by the advocates of consolidation. So one of their tactics was to paper the city of Brooklyn with arguments in favor of consolidation. And they tried to be strategic about this. Who's likely to vote for it and how to get those votes out? Who's likely to be against it and how can we neutralize their fears? This was serious politics.
The referendum ballot was simple and to the point. It merely said for consolidation and against consolidation. Greene had hedged his bet. The referendum was non-binding. If it didn't go his way, he would still have options. Residents of Manhattan voted overwhelmingly in favor of consolidation. More land, more people, more glory for the already great city, they figured. Less developed districts also came out in favor, but for different reasons.
One of the main things cities did in the 19th century was pave streets, build sewers, gain access to water supply, build water lines, and regulate utilities. New York City had the experience of providing those kind of facilities. You see just drawings of Manhattan, and it's pictures of houses going up on streets. The streets move up into fields, and houses are going up as they move up the island. People in the surrounding territory saw that sort of mechanism and envied it and wanted into it. So people who were speculating in real estate or who were looking for better services favored annexation or consolidation, and that pattern is quite consistent.
Queens County and Staten Island, both largely undeveloped, came out for consolidation. In fact, Staten Island had the highest per capita pro-consolidation vote, almost 4-1 in favor. It was a different story in the annexed district that had joined New York 20 years earlier.
Some of the opposition to consolidation came from that area. They saw that there were a lot of improvements that they needed, and they did not want to share access to the lower Manhattan Central Business District tax base with anybody else.
And then there was Brooklyn.
The oldest areas nearest the docks had entrenched political organizations that were likely to be reduced in importance by the creation of Greater New York. They got out the vote against consolidation. The more affluent areas in Brooklyn had more people who worked in Manhattan, even though much of the anti-consolidation propaganda had been directed at them. Those were the areas that voted strongly for consolidation. Further out in Brooklyn, there was strong support for consolidation because those were areas where there was real need for more investment in physical facilities.
129,000 Brooklyn ballots were cast. Consolidation passed by 277 votes, fewer people than could fit in 5 of Brooklyn's famous trolley cars. Why did British General Howe capture Brooklyn? Ran the popular joke. So he'd have a place to sleep before he took New York. Brooklyn was often compared to New York City and never quite measured up. Sure, Brooklyn had Coney Island, but New York had Wall Street. When residents of the smaller city pointed to their world-renowned Greenwood Cemetery, New Yorkers would chuckle and say, "Yes, Brooklyn is a good place to die in."
That's the way New York looked at Brooklyn, as a place far more prudish, far more stiff, more staid, less likely to bend the rules to get something done. If you wanted to get something done, you went to New York. If you wanted to obey the rules, you went to Brooklyn.
The results of the referendum set the Brooklyn anti-consolidationists into action. They organized the Brooklyn League of Loyal Citizens and adopted the city's flag as their symbol. The Loyal League derided the movement as Green's hobby and published a series of alarmist pamphlets with titles like Against Consolidation and Taxes and Tenements. Union with New York, they warned, would open the floodgates and spill Manhattan's slums, criminals, and immigrants into Brooklyn.
Some of the resistance on the part of Brooklynites, some Brooklynites, to annexing with New York was that New York was full of new immigrants and it was full of Catholics, and these weren't Brooklyn sorts of people, and Brooklyn didn't want to be engulfed in this sea of otherness.
And, the League argued, consolidation would endanger Brooklyn's much-admired public school system.
In New York City, there was no free public high school until 1900. Brooklyn already had the tradition of Erasmus High School and I think a more fully developed school system, and there was a sense Brooklyn is a more civilized place, a place with better civic institutions.
Brooklyn's anti-consolidation movement sought to perpetuate the city's provincial Protestant Yankee heritage. They proudly reminded people of Brooklyn's nickname, the City of Churches.
Many of the great thinkers, many of the great preachers to come out of America came out of Brooklyn. Henry Ward Beecher. Only the most prominent of what were really dozens of central intellectual figures who really defined Brooklyn as a kind of a middle seaboard Boston in a way, giving that kind of tone of reflection and probity and moral upstanding.
The League pushed for what it called resubmission, a second, this time binding, referendum. The League found a voice in the Brooklyn Eagle. The Eagle had launched the crusade for the Brooklyn Bridge and had chased corrupt boss John McCain to Sing Sing. It was the city's standard-bearer and friend. Years before, the Eagle had been edited by Walt Whitman. Now it was run by St. Clair McKelway, a pious, opinionated editor who had transformed the Eagle into a paper of international repute. Under him, an observer wrote, the staff used typewriters and telephones and learned how to spell Gerolman Street. The Eagle sponsored an anti-consolidation song contest. The winner was titled Up with the Flag of Brooklyn.
Up with the flag that long has waved o'er Brooklyn city fair.
In 1895, Andrew Green and others introduced consolidation bills in the state legislature. The Loyal League snapped into action, opening a lobbying office in Albany and sending anti-consolidation circulars to the legislature. The Eagle demanded referendum or nothing, and the mayor and the Common Council condemned the bills.
Unhurt by faction's withering blast.
When the dust settled, the resolutions were dead.
And nail it to the mast.
Andrew Green was unimpressed with Brooklyn's theatrics.
It is a sort of senile sentimentalism which vainly strives to stay the wheels of beneficent progress by a display of flags and banners, the din of brass bands and other claptrap, to capture the thoughtless and the unwary. Andrew Haswell Green.
And to keen observers, there was a hollow ring to much of the anti-consolidation rhetoric.
There was a very, very strong element of hypocrisy as far as Brooklyn resisting being taken over by hostile elements, shall we say, of Manhattan, because Brooklyn did the same thing.
For years, the city of Brooklyn had been absorbing neighboring townships in Kings County.
They were annexed. They did not join voluntarily. They were annexed by the city of Brooklyn.
As for the nativist argument, Brooklyn had been gradually turning into a middle-class bedroom community of transplanted Manhattanites.
People understood that it was a place that you worked by day in New York and you went home to your family at night in Brooklyn.
There were even more compelling reasons for Brooklynites to favor consolidation.
No one would loan money to Brooklyn. Nobody would buy Brooklyn bonds. At the time of the consolidation, Brooklyn was basically frozen out of the bond markets.
Brooklynites suffered under high taxes, compounded by a nationwide economic depression. New York City had the rich tax base that could afford to pave the streets and run the sewers that Brooklyn so desperately needed. And there was another thing New York City had.
New York has one of the great water supplies of any cities in the world. New York developed an extraordinary system of tunnels and reservoirs and canals to bring water to the city. New York leaders were not about to share it with Brooklyn. There's access to a water supply on Long Island, but it's not a large water supply that was easily turned into the water that was needed by a big city. And Brooklyn was a big city, so it had a very large need for water as well as for revenues.
By the middle of 1895, the consolidation question had reached a legislative stalemate. The only man who could break that stalemate lived at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Thomas Collier Platt was a three-time U.S. Senator and at the time of consolidation, the undisputed Republican power broker in New York State. A nod from him could make or break mayors, governors, even presidents. Platt was a quiet man who never lost his temper in public. He was born in 1833 in the small village of Owego in upstate New York. He was raised in a modest home, attended the local academy, and opened a drugstore in downtown Owego. Platt was drawn to the fledgling Republican Party, and the back room of his store soon became the unofficial local party headquarters. There, he cultivated a following from the upstate constituency that would be his power base for the rest of his career. Platt became an unabashed, old-school party man. He believed in patronage and the spoils system. He spoke of a friend.
What I liked about him then, as always, was his bold and persistent contention that the citizen who best loved his party and was loyal to it was loyal to and best loved his country. Thomas Collier Platt.
Platt was a boss, but he was no crook. Even his enemies admitted that he was honest. Many hundreds of thousands of dollars passed through his hands annually, said one critic, and I don't believe that one penny ever sticks to his fingers.
He was a fairly prominent businessman as well as being a politician. He was the president of U.S. Express Company from 1880 to 1910, some 30 years. So he had an outside income, so to speak.
He was a behind-the-scenes leader, called an easy boss because he specialized in leading people where they were prepared to go.
He did his best not to twist arms too hard, but in the end he did figure out what coalitions would work, what compromises had to be made, and he would persuade people that's what we have to do.
He had a habit of requiring legislative leaders to come down to meet with him on Sunday afternoons at the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York. It was called Platt's Sunday School.
He had a favorite corner of the lobby where he would sit and meet with Republican leaders. It was called the Amen Corner. They would sit, figure out what to do. Once they had decided on it, everyone would say Amen.
Few spots have ever been more hallowed to me than the Amen Corner. Many a governmental policy and many a candidate for office have been determined in that nook. Thomas Collier Platt.
The Republican Party ran New York State, and Thomas Collier Platt ran the Republican Party.
Early on, he's not sure what Greater New York has to do with him or the Republican Party. He had really a hands-off attitude toward the question.
But that changed in 1895. Why did Platt embrace consolidation? New York and Brooklyn had elected Republican mayors, but the party's grip, especially on New York City, was tenuous.
The newcomers, the immigrants who were coming into Manhattan, were definitely going to vote Democrat. So the Republicans were part of the constituency of the Brooklyn electorate. So therefore it would be very logical to combine the two and sort of outnumber that possible Democratic majority in Manhattan.
And if his party lost at the ballot box, Platt still had the state legislature. He could make the argument that Greater New York was too new or too big to run itself, and he could control it from Albany. 4 decades earlier, Greater New York had got its first real taste of state commissions.
Between 1857 and 1859, the New York State Legislature decided that the elected officials in New York City should not be left in charge of the operations of that city. And so they created a series of state commissions to operate the fire system, the police system, and to develop Central Park.
All the policemen had worn badges with the New York State seal. Platt resolved to push consolidation through in 1896, without a new referendum and regardless of opposition. Platt set his plan in motion. He summoned Governor Levi P. Morton to a strategy session at the home of Benjamin Tracy. They struck a deal. Platt got Morton on board behind consolidation. But their arrangement unraveled almost immediately. Morton wrote Tracy that he was having misgivings. Platt responded.
My dear Governor, I put it mildly when I say to you that I was disgusted and disheartened when General Tracy handed me your letter to him relative to Greater New York. When we had the
Everyone who was New York governor imagined himself a United States senator, and some thought of the White House. Certainly that was true of Governor Levi P. Morton, and curiously he placed his hopes in Platt to secure the presidency for him.
If you persist in the policy which you have outlined in your letter, we might as well quit right where we are. In such case, I will not feel like taking off my coat and doing the work I contemplated doing in the presidential matter. Thomas Platt.
Platt had no official standing in the legislature. He needed a frontman to pilot consolidation through. He chose the diminutive Republican senator from Nyack, Clarence Lexow. Little Lexow, as the papers called him, was a small man with a big name. 2 years earlier, he had chaired the commission that had exposed a shocking history of police corruption in New York City. Officers had broken down on the stand and confessed their crimes. Lexow, who had been half-hearted about the investigation in the first place, was an unwitting hero.
He was so popular that a new verb to Lexow was common in the language, and it meant to investigate or to expose.
Despite Lexow's law degree from Columbia University, anti-consolidationists portrayed him as a meddlesome hayseed from the sticks. But Lexow had his eye on the governor's chair and would not disappoint the easy boss. Lexow convinced the legislature to create a committee on consolidation.
Senator Lexow was chair of the committee that held the public hearings in Brooklyn, New York City, and Albany. He used this gavel to conduct the hearings.
Gentlemen of the committee, I tell you, we are on the verge of bankruptcy. Unite the interest of these great cities and give to Brooklyn some of the wealth which she has helped to create.
Will Mr. Burtis tell us when has New York ever had anything other than opposition for Brooklyn's interests? Never once has New York had anything but ridicule and contempt for us here.
Platt was taking a calculated risk. He knew that his tactics might result in an anti-Republican backlash.
Landlords will say that consolidation has increased the value of their property, and they will prove it by raising our rent. I will never vote for any man who uses his influence to force consolidation without giving the working men a chance to vote on the question. M.V. Zimmerman, Brooklyn, New York.
Anti-consolidationist Jesse Johnson dictated a letter to Clarence Lexow about a routine legal matter. Signing it, he paused, saddened by the bitterness that had developed between the opposing camps. He added a postscript. I would shake hands with you across the bloody chasm. Perhaps, he added hopefully, someday it may be less apparent. The committee proposed a consolidation bill that would take effect on January 1st, 1898, uniting nearly 40 municipalities into today's Greater New York City. The charter defining the new city's government would be drafted after the bill's passage. There would be no new referendum. The bill easily passed the Senate and the Assembly. But then it had to go to the mayors of New York, Brooklyn, and Long Island City for their approval.
They've passed it, huh? I suppose they will send the bill down here soon, and then we'll have some fun with it. Mayor William Strong.
Reform Mayor Strong of New York City favored consolidation, but was no friend of Tom Platt. He distrusted any scheme which did not spell out the structure of the new government beforehand. He and Mayor Worcester of Brooklyn vetoed the bill. It would have to be passed by the legislature a second time if it was to become law. It was easy to forget that there was a third player at the consolidation table, Long Island City. Long Island City was a crude working man's town, headed by a crude working man's mayor. Boastful and corrupt, Patrick Jerome Gleason had been born in Ireland and made his fortune distilling alcohol in California. He was not above physically assaulting his opponents. And when the Long Island Railroad built a depot against his wishes, Gleason took a sledgehammer and leveled it to the ground. Thereafter, his political symbol was the battle axe. Gleason supported consolidation, mostly because he believed that he would be made mayor of the unified city. The bill went back to Albany. Again, the measure easily passed in the Senate. But before it reached the Assembly, the bill encountered trouble. Republican unity had begun to crack. Brooklyn assemblymen, under pressure from the Loyal League, came out against the bill. Upstate representatives, too, began to waver in their support. Then word came from Tammany Hall that the Democrats, who had allied with Platt earlier, would now vote against passage. Awakened to the prospect of a Republican-controlled greater city, they could not be coaxed back in line. Platt was in trouble. Cutting short his vacation, he took a non-stop train from Florida to New York. He strove to solidify the Republican vote with political threats and promises. Clarence Lexow worked the Assembly floor and was threatened with expulsion if he did not cease his lobbying. The day before the vote, the Brooklyn Eagle cried foul play.
Seldom on the floor of the Assembly chamber has there ever been witnessed so fierce and close a struggle as attended the passage of this bill. Clarence Lexow.
On April 22nd, 1896, after a tense 2-hour debate, the bill passed by 2 votes, and Governor Morton signed it into law.
I received a call from Andrew H. Green. Bubbling over with joy, that venerable patriot exclaimed, "I came in to express my gratitude to the father of Greater New York." I could not refrain from saying, "And I desire to express my appreciation of the work of the grandfather of the Greater New York." Tom Platt.
Catalina Paez and her pro-consolidation debate team were trounced by the girls of the Philomathian Society. The normal school prize debate, at least, went Brooklyn's way. Songwriters saw the consolidation as an opportunity to sell sheet music. They wrote songs titled The One New York Two-Step, Old Knickerbocker Jr., and the Jubilee March of the Greater New York. Even Tom Platt inspired a tune, the Easy Boss Two-Step. A charter defining the greater city's government was drafted by a committee headed by Platt's friend, Benjamin Tracy. Platt's new governor, Frank Black, signed the charter into law and handed the pen to Platt as a keepsake. Greater New York was the second largest city in the world. It had over 3 million people, ranking only behind London. It embraced 360 square miles and was crossed by nearly 3,000 miles of streets. But what to name the new metropolis? Most people favored keeping New York. Still, newspapers were filled with suggestions from the public. Mr. Samuel H. Belcher proposed the City of America. As expected, someone weighed in with the name Brooklyn.
Certainly, New York is all too childish a name for a great city. Simply a new edition of a little English town. Brooklyn is original, euphonious, and already adapted to a large part of the new city.
Another Brooklynite said they might as well name the city after its new founding father and call the place Plattopolis. On New Year's Eve of 1897, Jamaica, and most other towns to be joined into Greater New York, blew whistles and banged drums. Newtown's minister delivered an oration on the town's history, and Rockaway's fire department held a dance. The Long Island City Board of Aldermen worked right up to the end, passing their tax budget just 2 minutes shy of midnight. In Brooklyn, the mood was more somber. It was raining. There was a public ceremony that evening at Brooklyn City Hall. Mayor Worcester, St. Clair McElway, and others spoke. The poet Will Carleton read The Passing of Brooklyn, a poem he had written for the occasion. As midnight approached, a crowd gathered outside. The rain had stopped, and the night was clear and cold. The people fell silent. Then the bell tolled the hour. Cannon booms from New York rolled across the East River and were answered by the whistles of the Brooklyn Elevated Railroad. 2 flags were raised over the building, one of Brooklyn, the other of New York. Some men cheered, some men wept. But in their hearts, they all believed the words they had heard earlier that evening. Brooklyn it is, Brooklyn it remains, and Brooklynites are we. At the last stroke of 12, the city that they said was a good place to die in was itself no more. A raucous crowd in Manhattan rang in the new year at City Hall with bands and fireworks. An electrical device was supposed to raise the flag at midnight at the signal of San Francisco's mayor, 3,000 miles away. It malfunctioned. The next day, newly inaugurated Mayor Van Wyck made an unremarkable speech at noon, a harbinger of his upcoming term. 10 months later, a grateful city got around to showing its appreciation to the man who had helped create it. On his 76th birthday, Andrew Green was presented with a gold commemorative medal. On it were allegorical figures representing the 5 boroughs. In the background was the harbor that had started it all.
The consolidation of Greater New York, I think, has its pluses and minuses. I think there are certain things that run more smoothly as a result of the consolidation. I don't think we'll ever really, in our hearts, be part of New York. In Brooklyn, we're going over to the city when we go to Manhattan, even though we're in the city, and people, of course, do not understand that unless they come from here.
I was born in Brooklyn in 1944, which is, half a century into the consolidation, right? But the rivalries was still as great, if not greater, 40, 50 years later. In my family, there was a rivalry between Brooklyn and Manhattan. My father's family from Manhattan, my mother's family from Brooklyn. My father made me a Yankee fan 1 mile from Ebbets Field, at a time in which being a Yankee fan in Brooklyn was something you had to be fearful of. It was truly a dangerous thing to do.
In practical terms, consolidation meant that for 50 years and more, almost all the territory into which the population of New York moved in terms of suburban development was within a single city government.
So we're able to do things that can't be done in other places. New York City Police Department is as large, if not larger, than the FBI.
Who cares who the treasurer is of a small town? But for New York, the controller of the city of New York engages in bond operations that are of major significance to the bond markets.
The very idea of consolidation, the idea of a city environment based on coming together, not in a coercive way, but in a way that maximizes the potential, economic potential, but also potential of another kind, simple human potential. New Yorkers have a right to be extraordinarily proud of their history because it stands some modest chance of offering an example to people everywhere, to Americans everywhere, and I think to people around the world. An example of how it might be possible to get along now that it's inevitable that we all live in the same place. As we remember this anniversary of consolidation, it's moving to remember how crucial a role New York has played, not only in the past, but in forecasting and even creating the future for Americans and indeed for people around the world.
The Brooklyn Eagle survived consolidation, but not the labor troubles and competition from other papers that closed it in 1955. In 1942, partly as a publicity stunt, its new publisher had commissioned a study to explore undoing the mistake of '98, as some Brooklynites called consolidation. The matter was not treated quite so lightly by Staten Islanders. They had voted more strongly in favor of consolidation than any other district in 1894. But in 1990, feeling that their needs were being ignored, they voted overwhelmingly to study the possibility of seceding. The destinies of the two main players in the consolidation story turned with the pull of a trigger. Thomas Collier Platt unwittingly engineered his own downfall by brokering a deal to give Governor Teddy Roosevelt the vice presidential nomination. He hoped to get the pesky, reform-minded Roosevelt out of New York State. But the move backfired. President McKinley was assassinated, and that damned cowboy was installed in the White House. Platt's federal patronage dried up, and reformers dismantled his machine system. Platt lived to see the Fifth Avenue Hotel, home of his beloved Amen Corner, demolished in 1908. Thomas Easy Boss Platt died of Bright's disease in 1910. He was buried in Owego, where many local residents, but few of his former political colleagues, paid their respects. Andrew Green became the greater city's elder statesman. He delivered commencement addresses and championed civic causes. On November 13th, 1903, the 83-year-old Green was entering his Park Avenue home when he was accosted by a stranger, Cornelius Williams. Williams pulled out a revolver and fired 5 shots at the old man's head, killing him instantly. The murder was a case of mistaken identity. Williams had been jilted by his mistress and sought out the man he suspected to be her new lover. That man had a slight resemblance to Andrew Green. News of Green's death shocked and saddened the city.
The mayor at that time ordered flags flown at half-mast. There was a religious service at the Brick Presbyterian Church for him. A commission was made for a portrait of him, major portrait, which today hangs in City Hall. And most importantly, probably or most dramatically, there was a service held for him in City Hall in tribute to all his accomplishments.
In 1929, atop a hill in Central Park, a white granite bench was built. The bench and the hill were named in memory of the man who had helped create the park and the city in which that park stood. Around the bench were planted 5 elm trees. Today the trees no longer stand, but the 5 boroughs of the one city they represented remain, a testament to the man they call the father of Greater New York.